and very honored to be the director of UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning. And it is a great pleasure to welcome you all to Paris and to IIEP. It's particularly delightful, I think, for all of us to get to meet each other, having exchanged online for over 2 weeks. It was a very active online phase of this technical roundtable on disability inclusive education sector planning. So welcome to all of you. My task is relatively simple. I'm going to introduce our esteemed speakers for the opening, and it is a pleasure for me to do so. And a particular pleasure to introduce Stefania Giannini, the Assistant Director General for Education for UNESCO, on her first visit to IIEP. But as we said, it's only been 2 months, so yes, we're very, very pleased. Ms. Stefania Giannini was appointed in May 2018, becoming the top United Nations official in the field of education. And in this position, she provides strategic vision and leadership for UNESCO's education sector in coordinating and monitoring the implementation of the Education 2030 Agenda, encapsulated in Sustainable Development Goal 4. Ms. Giannini has devoted her career to promoting education as a fundamental human right for all through the importance of language, lifelong learning, culture, freedom of expression, and identity in an effort to ensure more inclusive and equal societies. This commitment, I think, runs very deep in her. Ms. Giannini has an academic background in the humanities with a doctorate PhD in linguistics and became professor of linguistics in 1992. She served as the rector of the University for Foreigners of Perugia from 2004 to 2012, being one of the first female rectors and the youngest at that time in Italy. During these years, Ms. Giannini coordinated a number of relevant international projects in the field of higher education and research, contributing to the improvement of university cooperation between Europe and several other countries, from the United States to countries in Asia and Middle East and North Africa. At the same time, Ms. Giannini was member of the selection committee of the Erasmus Mundus program in Brussels, the person responsible for international relations in the Committee for the Conference of Italian University Rectors, and a member of the National Commission for the Promotion of Italian Culture Abroad at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Later, she served in the role as senator in the Republic of Italy and Minister of Education, Universities, and Research from 2014 to 2016. Developing and implementing structural reform of the Italian education system centered on social inclusion and targeting cultural awareness. Ms. Giannini also chaired the Education and Competitiveness Council of the European Union during the Italian presidency, working to promote the importance of creativity, cultural heritage, and innovation as tools for, dialogue between diverse populations, with a view to preventing radicalization and extremism. In addition to her current position as UNESCO's Assistant Director General for Education, Ms. Giannini is advisor to the European Commissioner for Research and Innovation, as well as a member of the Atlantis Group of the Barkey Foundation and of the Research, Innovation, and Science Policy experts. It is a great pleasure to welcome you here. I will take the opportunity to also introduce our second speaker. IEP is very pleased to be partnering both with our colleagues in the education sector at headquarters and with UNICEF on this technical roundtable. And I'm very pleased indeed to have finally met UNICEF's Global Senior Advisor on Children with Disabilities and to have her here with us today. Rosangela Berman-Bieler heads UNICEF's Disabilities section in New York. Prior to this, she worked for the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and other UN agencies and international organizations as an inclusive development specialist. Among other associations, Ms. Bieler founded the Inter-American Institute on Disability and Inclusive Development, created in the late 1990s to promote social, economic, and political inclusion in Latin America and Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa and Asia. The Inter-American Institute played a key role in the development of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Originally from Brazil, Rosangela has been a disability rights advocate for more than 40 years. In hopes that our colleague from the GEM report will arrive momentarily, I will also introduce her. She's our third speaker for the opening session. And Katarzyna Kubaka is a research officer with the Global Education Monitoring Report, known as the GEM report. It's published by UNESCO and is, although editorially independent, is an evidence-based annual report which monitors progress towards education targets in the Sustainable Development Goals framework. Before joining the GEM report, Katarzyna worked at OECD, Education and Skills Directorate, as a policy analyst on Education and Social Progress Project, and the Teaching and Learning International Survey, known as TALIS. Much of Katarzyna's work concentrates on the relationship between teaching and learning, skills development, and well-being. She holds a PhD and MSc in social psychology from the Free University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and a bachelor's in social and cognitive psychology from Jacobs University in Bremen. So these are, as you see, we've pulled together an excellent panel, and I'd like to take the opportunity to now turn the microphone over to the intellectual leader for education at UNESCO.
Thank you so much. Really, thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I'm really very, very happy and honored to be here. And let me first of all deeply thank Susanne, the director of IEP, all the team, all our people here, and Rosangela from UNICEF for inviting me to this roundtable dedicated to inclusion, disabilities, and education. From our point of view, UNESCO is one of the main global actors strongly committed about this issue. And let me also, as a premise, Susanne emphasized the importance of our partnership with UNICEF, with GPE. Just yesterday, we had the opportunity to launch from New York. I was connected from Paris here by Skype. This very important initiative, maybe you know, about youth, the Youth Global Agenda. Now that the new title is Generation Now. And I think that also in this framework we'll be able to approach the question of inclusion and to focus also on disabilities, which is one of the chapters more important in my opinion. Thanks also for mentioning all the experiences I have in my career, in my life. Just to say that I had the opportunity as Minister of Education and University and Research in my country recently to, until couple of years ago, to face and to approach the question of disabilities and the Italian education systems. And maybe I can also try to take some points in terms of very concrete action plan we tried them to implement. But my purpose today, of course, as almost new after a couple of months ADG for education at UNESCO, to present our framework, the framework we are moving on. You already mentioned 2030 agenda and the SDGs. You know, the fourth is our objective in terms of focusing exclusively on education, but we also know that education as a topic is a cross-cut in all the other objectives. So this is our strong mandate. We are in the big family of the United Nations, the unique specialized agency on education, and we can cover all the track, starting from the pre-childhood to higher education and post-graduation. So I think that it's a huge responsibility as I feel now, and it's a tremendous opportunity, I think, to really to implement this agenda in order to make a better society, of course, and order also and more inclusive, to give the opportunity all over the world to our children, our youth, and all citizens to have inclusive growth, which means I want to remind all of us the claim, which is in some way the title of the 2030 Framework Agenda, nobody left behind. I think that this is our framework in some way. And in the second part of my short presentation, I would like to present, to introduce the UNESCO Action Plan about inclusion, all the initiatives we're running on, and all the next steps we have in the near future. So just mentioning a bit the importance of 2030 agenda. It's really a very, very ambitious project, maybe the most ambitious we have, because it covers all different big challenges we have now in the world, without any distinction between developing countries and so-called advanced countries. I don't think there is no more separation and division between us and them, or in some way, or the North and the South. We absolutely share some big challenges. I can mention some of them, from climate change, respecting our environment, our planet. We have only this one, and it's also by means of education that we can share a culture of sustainability in this dimension, in this domain. But of course, just going straight on to our main topics we're dealing with, of course, it's a question of disseminating all over the world a culture of inclusion by means of education, which is the key factor, you should say, the main important driver of change. And just looking at the education system's evolution all over the world, I think that we can say, and we must be also, as UNESCO, very, very proud of it. It's been a huge progress in the last 10, 15 years, also thanks to some very important initiative UNESCO launched. I just mentioned Education for All, which was one of the main huge program which allowed many countries to reach a level of access, a good level of access, quality education, starting from the primary schools, and also filling the gender gap, which is still there as a problem, but we did a lot of progress also in this domain too. But there is something we have to underline, which is the challenges we are still facing at the moment. I'm quoting from our UIS data. Also, 264 million children are out of the school all over the world, and 100 million are unable to read. They don't have any literacy, basic competencies. So just also referring to these two simple numbers, I think we are all aware of the huge responsibility we have, the hard work we have in front of us. And I think that our priority now, our priority, I should say, of course, as UNESCO education sector, as UNESCO as a United Nations specialized agency in this field, but also as this, I should say, very important global commitment for education, which is made from partnerships with other very important partners and agencies. I mentioned UNICEF, but also GPE and our institutes, of course, which are part of the team. our priority is taking care of the most frail part of this group. And inside is 100 million of people, of children who are out of the process or out of the schooling system. There is a part which is more frail, which is in some way the target of our action plan. And children, youth with disability are most likely to suffer from exclusion from education, and they have less possibilities to reach the target and to accomplish the process of training. We have very good important scientific evidence for this statement, because our Institute for Statistics, UIS, has recently published, I think, the most comprehensive analysis of this kind of data. I want to mention something about it. It covers 49 countries, which is a very good basis. We have to, of course, to improve and to collect more data from the most part countries of the world, but it's still a good basis to have some very clear evidence about disabilities and education. And I see more or less four very important issue we must take into account. First, children and youth with disabilities are less likely to ever attend school. Second, children and youth with disabilities are more likely to be out of the school. In these numbers I quoted before. Third, they tend to have a fewer education. So also those children and those people who are inside the process and the school training, and then I can mention my personal experience as minister about this specific issue, have a fewer education, and they have more troubles, more difficulties to reach the targets. And four, this is another very important point I think we must not neglect, of course, women with disabilities are often less likely to reap the benefits of formal education. So, starting from these four evidences we have on the table now, I think that we must really try to launch an action plan in order to see which are the more effective initiatives we can propose to governments, to school systems, to teachers, to education communities, just involving, because it's a very relevant issue in my opinion, to civil society, families, because this is another very important part of the job. Well, our mission now, which is our mission at UNESCO, and which is our mission in our global commitment for education, just focusing on inclusion and disabilities. I think that we need really a call for action, because all these kind of policies are directly responsibility of governments, so we need to implement our advocacy and our consulting governments about this issue. And I think that our main purpose, the final goal of our action plan, should be raising awareness about the issue of disabilities all over the world. Just let me say a few words about the European framework. I know a bit more in terms of direct experience. I had the privilege and the opportunity to do here in this part of the world. Yes, there are some countries like Italy, for instance, which invested a lot of money and a lot of different specific measures and initiatives to face and to approach disability in the school systems by means, one I want to mention, giving the largest number we could of support teachers. So every class has the opportunity to have one or two support teachers just to be together with regular teachers of the normal disciplines like maths, literature, and something. And this measure is in some way important. We can also try to look at and maybe to share some best practices we have, not also in Italy, but also in other European countries. I want to mention Finland, which has a different model, but which is still one of the most committed countries in this sector. But in my opinion, and we also see the results after 10 years of this kind of policy, it is not enough. It is not enough because the issue of disabilities is not simply in the class, but it's something we must see in a strong connection, a strong link with the real life outside the school, outside the classroom, and then we have the importance of involving families and supporting families when there is a huge problem in terms of giving our children the same opportunity other children have. So just to mention some very concrete policies. So our action plan, first, a call for action with governments, just referring to UNESCO's very important normative instruments which we have in our hands, and they are still there. And for some countries, they are still there without any ratification and implementation. The first one I want to mention, 1960, the convention, the first convention against discrimination, and more recently, 2006, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So there are two very important reference points. We have to remind governments and try to push and to call for action and awareness at that level. Second, I think mobilizing partnerships and cooperation at all levels we can, developing, implementing disability inclusive education policies. And this is the second, I think, very important, very concrete and very effective goal we have. And I think that at this level, it's not a simply question of talking to governments, but as I said before, try to really engage civil society about this issue. Third, I think that we also try to mobilize more than we did in the past, the so-called private sector, because it's not simply a question of funding, it's a question of disseminating the private sector, the culture of inclusion and the culture, just mentioning company policies, which are very important, and it's the second step after education, in terms of how the global market is facing this issue. So I think that our task as UNESCO, just because we are moving in the framework of 2030 agenda, and just because we have the UN agency, which has the strong mandate to coordinate by means of the steering committee, the fourth objective and all the education agenda, I think that we really try in the near future to reach a fourth objective, which is the development of a cross-sector policies, plans, and programs based on a systematic analysis of disequalities. I mentioned the UIS recent report about these 49 countries. It's a lot. It's a very good basis, but I think that we have improved and we have to go on beyond this first result. And also UIS as another very important responsibility, which is try to harmonize the definition and the calculation of the different data in order to elaborate an indicator. No, they already made something about it, but we are not yet at the end of the process, because if we have really a science-based indicator about disabilities, we are we are more powerful to also to talk to governments and say, yes, you are here, and maybe it's important that you reach this other highest level. And there is yes, I want to mention that there is a very important initiative which is looking forward to this fourth objective, which is the interagency group on education inequality indicators. UIS organized a research team about this issue, and we are supporting this kind of initiative. Well, just to conclude my short presentation, just to mention the two very important the next steps. We are going to try to involve all of you, and I hope you can join us in these two very important, relevant occasions we have in our agenda next year. First, the International Forum. We are going to organize on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Salamanca Declaration. You know, we would like to let me say, it's so important, in my opinion, from my point of view, sometimes this celebration, we have the risk that they remain a celebration. We don't do like this. Salamanca Declaration is something very important, still very important for us, but this should be really the good opportunity, the good occasion at global level to relaunch the action plan and to start with this civic engagement, and a world conference on special needs in education. Special needs is another chapter. I didn't discuss today about it because maybe it implies different issues, but it's really another very important chapter in the field of inclusive education, especially in the primary, in the primary schools, where children sometimes you can say that they have some disabilities, but they simply need special teaching process, and it's important in this case to have very well-trained teachers, because this is the other dimension we have to take into account. And finally, really very, very last remark and invitation, as you mentioned, Susanne, 2020 Global Monitoring Report, which is an independent editorial and intellectual very important work our group of GEM since 10 more years does at UNESCO, will be focused on inclusion and education. This year will be on migration and displacement and education, and in a couple of years they will dedicate it to this, their activities and collecting data, and also this should be a very important opportunity for us to have science evidence-based and clear picture of the state of the art where we are, and just looking forward, because nobody left behind is really a wonderful, very simple claim, but I think that words matter, but we must try to implement the semantic power of words by means of action plan, by means of patient, by means of strong commitment. We already and you more than others are dedicated to this issue. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is greatly appreciated. And now I'm going to invite Rosangela to make her presentation. The ADG and I will move to chairs so we don't block your view of the slides.
Good morning, everybody. Big pleasure to be here, privilege to be here representing UNICEF as Global Senior Advisor on Disability, but more important, I want to commend our colleagues and partners in UNICEF of the education section. They are the ones leading technically the issue on inclusive education, doing fantastic work together with the colleagues of UNESCO. It's fantastic to have this opportunity to have the joint event here. And thank you for both teams of UNICEF and the UNESCO IIEP for organizing this great event. It's an honor for me also to be sitting here because I'm just always inspired by Italy for being the first country that really decided to make a revolution on inclusive education and achieve a shift of paradigm from one moment to the other. With all the goods and bads of this, but we have a lot to learn from you, I'm sure. And I hope that you can bring this perspective to your work in UNESCO. Salamanca is a promise that did not achieve children with disabilities until now. And we have now the opportunity to fix it, even using the opportunity of the convention and the SDGs as well. So thank you again for the partnership and for the opportunity to be here today. So I would like to start talking about the most important thing, as you did, and that is the issue of data. So you're here. So we don't know how many children with disabilities are out there. Data on disabilities just starting to build and to become more reliable, I would say. The WHO and the World Bank report, the Global Report on Disability of 2011, said that 15% of children with disabilities live in the world with some types of impairments, being 5% with moderate to severe disabilities. And recent studies based on household surveys, the short set of questions of the Washington Group module on disability identified 1.5% of children with disabilities. So UNICEF recent household surveys using the child functioning module, UNICEF and Washington Group, reached to 5% or more. So we have a gap of at least 3.5% of children with disabilities, and where they are, we don't know. So data is the first challenge we need to address to strengthen education systems for inclusion. I think I will get just my water here. So education is a right and an enabler of other rights. As Ms. Giannini mentioned, we have the evidence that children with disabilities are less likely to go to school, less likely to access quality education. We know that about half of all children who live with a disability do not go to school because of prejudice, stigma, or lack of accessible learning opportunities, among many other barriers they have to face. And I even quote my friend and colleague, Dan Mont, who is here. The most important thing here is to understand that this is not due to their impairments, it's due to the lack of capacity in education systems to receive them and accommodate their learning styles, I would say. Every child has the capacity to learn. Each one of them, with or not, without impairments, have different learning styles. About half that go to school are not receiving the quality education they need. They lack the trained teachers, accessible facilities, or appropriate learning tools and environment they need. As global community, we will not achieve SDG 4 if we can continue failing children with disabilities, not just getting them into school, but improving the quality of education they receive. And we saw, as you said, so many children are in school and after 4th, 5th grade, they don't know how to read, maybe they can sign their names only. So quality education is something that will benefit children in general, not only children with disabilities. The key international framework we work on, reaffirming what you said as well, from the disability perspective, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, 177 countries already ratified the convention. We are close to universal ratification, which is very important, always to remind governments that this is a global commitment that now is supported by SDGs indicators as well. We have another important opportunity. The convention now is celebrating 11 years already of adoption, and we need to make sure we use the SDG framework to implement also the convention, one supporting the other, one framework supporting the other. So the education Article 24 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities addresses the rights of education for persons with disabilities, giving some guidance even on implementation. This is a characteristic of the convention, not only saying what, but what would be the way of getting there, how. And also we have the general comment number 4 of the convention related to Article 24 that was adopted in 2016, which brings a very comprehensive guidelines, I would say, and explanation of what inclusive education is. So it's something that we did not have until then, and now it's something that you can really count. So these are the frameworks that we are working now, and we feel much more based on, starting to be more based on evidence, but we already have the basis to move forward in a more solid way. The other question that comes immediately then, what is inclusive education? Everybody has a different definition of inclusive education. What is inclusive education? We today work with the concept that an education system that includes all students and welcomes and supports them to learn whoever they are and wherever their abilities or requirements. This means making sure that teaching and the curriculum, school buildings, classrooms, play areas, transport, and toilets are appropriate for all children at all levels. Inclusive education means all children learn together in the same school, not in separate systems, not in alternative systems, not in special systems, but in the same system. Important to understand what are the main paradigms actually that determine the process of getting children with disabilities to school until now. So we went from exclusion, that is when students are directly or indirectly prevented from or denied access to education in any form. And then we move to segregation. That is when the education of students with disabilities is provided in separate environments, designed or used to respond to particular or various impairments in isolation from students without disabilities. This is the special education systems that we have in most countries nowadays. Then we move to integration. That is a process of placing people with disabilities in existing mainstream education institutions, as long as they form the former can adjust to the standardized requirements of such institutions, meaning that you don't change the system, you try to adapt the people that function differently to a system that does not do anything to accommodate them. So the ones who have to adapt is the so-called outsiders. This is what we call integration. And then we go to what we are pushing today, that is inclusion, a process of systemic reform, embodying changes and modifications in content, teaching methods, approaches, structures, and strategies in education to overcome barriers with a vision of service, serving to provide all students with the relevant age range with an equitable and participatory learning experience and environments that best correspond to their requirements and preferences. So an important note is that placing students with disabilities within mainstream classes without accompanying structural changes to, for example, organization, curriculum, and teaching and learning strategies does not constitute inclusion. It's not just putting a student with a disability in a classroom on an inclusive classroom with other students without providing them the support they need. This is not really what we talk about when we talk about inclusive education. Furthermore, integration does not automatically guarantee that the transition from segregation to inclusion happens. Inclusive education is not compatible with the sustaining two systems of education, mainstream and special segregated education system, as I mentioned before. Yes. So now we would just talk a little bit about UNICEF work to achieve SDG 4 for learners with disabilities. We are working on 3 important frameworks. To meet this target, we are working on 142 countries around the world on inclusive education to build inclusive education systems that meet the needs of children with disabilities. Specific efforts are being made in 3 key areas. The first one is strengthen data on children with disabilities. UNICEF has now worked with the Washington Group, always following the same methodology of household surveys for not only education, but collecting data on children with disabilities in general. We have the UNICEF Washington Group data survey on child functioning. We also have the UNICEF Washington Group module on inclusive education that also is looking on participation and measuring the environment for education, not only the impairment of children, but measuring the environment, as this is what will determine exclusion or not, and not impairment. We also have guidelines for inclusive EMIs that will be presented here further in the program. It's very important to focus on administrative data as much as on household surveys. The second area that we are investing is support governments to strengthening national laws and policies, as well as education systems for inclusion. We are working here right now exactly doing this, and this is an important process that we have to invest everything within the system. So the inclusive education sector analysis guidelines and operational manuals that you are already familiar with, and will be even more after the 3 days, it's a typical example of how we are trying to do this and support it. The next thing is something that Philippe, who is here, also now former UNICEF, but he was a leader globally, being regional advisor in the Eastern and Central Europe region of UNICEF, working a lot with us in headquarters to prepare these 14 training booklets that now are translated in many different languages and cover for an education system many different aspects of it, from definition, classification, partnerships, mapping, financing, teacher training, etc. So even parents, family participation. So it's highly recommended as an important resource. The other area, finally, is investing in accessibility, assistive products, and innovations, such as accessible digital textbooks to help children with disabilities achieve their learning goals. This is an innovation that we'll hopefully be able to present on Thursday during lunchtime. Hope you are interested while you eat, to also see the presentation. A little challenge, but we will try. We have policies on accessibility. For example, we have an internal executive directive saying that UNICEF cannot build any program-related construction that is not accessible, meaning that we are talking about schools, child-friendly spaces, and any other thing that UNICEF builds, also related to premises of UNICEF. So we are very confident that this type of policy can also influence the UN system as a whole. Now we are going through a UN reform with a big disability lens. We are calling the swap on disability in the UN, and this is the type of thing that we want to see happening programmatically and also as inclusive organizations. We have also a big work with our supply divisions on making sure that we can shape markets and work on bulk procurement for assistive devices and assistive products in general, even on accessibility issues, like we are working on accessible latrine slabs for emergencies. And this is very relevant for education, because if you have a school without wash facilities, you really don't allow children to go to school, especially girls. And the digital textbooks that I already mentioned. So that's it for now for UNICEF. We look forward to working with our partners across governments, UN systems, NGOs, and especially DPOs, disabled people's organizations, to support millions of children and adults with disabilities, including in humanitarian contexts, to realize their full potential through the promise of education. Thank you very much. We look forward to the next speaker. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Sorry. Oh. That was bound to happen once. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Katarzyna Kubacka. I'm here to present the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report on inclusion in education. And thank you for mentioning it earlier already. This is just a short teaser of a presentation, and I have with me the concept note that I can distribute later for the 2020 report, which is the basis of public consultations, which are actually just starting this week. So it's a perfect timing to be here and to let you know about the report, and hopefully to get your interest in getting us feedback and giving us direction on what to cover. The focus of the report has been decided, the 2020 report has been decided as inclusion in education, and will follow the broad definition of inclusion, which is the spirit of the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, really. I mean, it is education for all and quality education for all. And it will follow the Article 24 and the comment which were mentioned before. So really the idea is to have a broad framework which makes sure, or which covers all learners and provides them with quality education. And in that broad framework, we want to have a special focus on disability. One reason is that, of course, disability has such a special place in inclusive education, really important space. But the other reason is also in the history of our report is that we quite often cover many different aspects that can make learners vulnerable to exclusion, such as poverty, gender, all the different dimensions, but perhaps disability quite often in the report was not covered to that extent as the other markers that make learners vulnerable to exclusion. And so for that report, we really want to give it a proper space and cover it in more detail. Just to give you a bit of an idea of a timeline, like I said, this is a good time to talk to you now and to get your interest and to get your feedback as well. We've finished conducting expert interviews, which fed into the creation of the concept note. The concept note is the basis of public consultations, which are starting now and will last till September. And in about September, October, we'll start the kind of internal process of drafting the report, commissioning background research. So it's really, really important to now get feedback from all of you about what are the areas that maybe are not covered that well and that maybe we could help to uncover. And then the idea is to launch the report in February 2020. So with the Global Education Monitoring Reports, because it's an annual publication, we're kind of always, we're just finishing the report for the migration and displacement, but already thinking ahead for the next report and even for 2021. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what's in the concept note and what we are looking for in terms of feedback. We want to cover inclusion in terms of physical, social, psychological, and also system level areas. We want to cover all the different diverse groups that might be vulnerable to exclusion in different contexts. It is a global education monitoring report, so we want to pay attention to the differences across different regions, across different countries as well, or regions within countries too. And we, for the purpose of the concept note, we've selected some of the main areas of inclusion in education that we want to cover. However, I would like to emphasize that we still welcome feedback on any other areas and things we might have missed in the concept note. And these are national frameworks, governance and finance, curriculum and learning materials, teachers, school leaders and support staff, schools and communities, parents and students themselves. And so the idea is to look at how these different elements can help foster inclusion within education. We have some questions and some requests for advice for the 2020 report. And these are, what are the key policy solutions for each of these solutions in inclusion, which will help us to ensure the SDG 4 agenda, which is quality education for all learners. Excuse me. How can these obstacles to inclusion education be anticipated and overcome? What are the arrangements that are needed to coordinate and collaborate among government sectors, tiers of governments, and with other stakeholders to ensure quality education for all? As it was mentioned before from a colleague from UNICEF and from the previous speeches, we know that inclusion is such a cross-sectorial matter, and that's something that we definitely want to pay attention in the report and something that we welcome your feedback. How do education systems monitor exclusion in education? We are a monitoring report, so of course the monitoring side is always important to us, and we would like to welcome feedback in terms of participation in education or access to education, but also fully participation in education. It's not enough just to have children in the school, but of course it's important to have them actually properly engaged and learning. And then we also looking in terms of feedback on what channels of financing are used for inclusive education policies around the world, and how are they monitored, and how do they affect local practices. We know that legal frameworks are important, but of course, without the proper governance and without the proper finance, they might just remain on paper and not actually impact learners' education. So we have the online consultation open as of this week, which is great. This is the link. So if you access the website, you can leave the comments at the kind of bottom of the page. That would be great. But if you have more elaborate comments, if there's some attachments that you would like to send us, this is the email address. And really, it would be fantastic to get your feedback. This could be in terms of what are the policies in your countries, but also could be questions that you are thinking of that maybe there's just not enough information out there and something that you think is really needed we would welcome feedback in that area as well. Like I mentioned, we will commission new research. This is something we do every year. So yes, any types of feedback, any types of questions are most welcome. And this is really a fantastic time now to send them. And we have the social media hashtag already, so please feel free to use it. And this is something that we'll use to generate discussion as we move along. So thank you very much. And if you have any more questions, also please feel free to email me. That would be really great. Thank you.
Okay, good. I'm sorry you have to listen so much this morning. But there will be lots of discussions during the 3 days, I promise. You really have had to listen a lot, and you haven't really had opportunities to ask questions. So we apologize for that, but we're pretty much front-loaded the presentations. So what I'm going to talk about now is, and Mark is the facilitator, so that's why you're standing tall next to me, to intimidate me.
That's right.
Okay. So if I go wrong, Mark will tell me off. But just before I go into talking about the IIEP and UNICEF commitments, I just want to say a few things about security issues and things that you might want to be aware of while you're here, because in some sessions I've been to in many countries, you do actually have a security briefing initially. Of course, you're in Paris, so you think, well, it's it's a Western country, it's a wealthy nation, and so on. So sometimes you think, well, there's maybe no security issues, but of course that is not true. It's like SDG 4 stands for everything, security stands for every country as well. But the first thing to say is just in terms of access, I think you've probably worked it out now. People are around at the lifts and people are downstairs. They will let you into the staircase and so on. So there are always people to help you. And on this level as well, we have a gents toilet or a male toilet, whatever you want to call it, and a female or a woman's toilet. And we also have a toilet which is accessible for people with disabilities on this level, okay? And it's just down the corridor there. Another thing is just if you want to get around in Paris, there's a very good transport system. It's very integrated. You have metro, you have train, and you have buses and so on. And you buy one ticket which can take you on all those different modalities. But the metro system is not very good in terms of accessibility for people with disabilities. Okay, the buses are much better, they have ramps. Crossing the road, I think this is always extremely important. There are zebra crossings in France. Now, I'm from UK, so if you stand on a zebra crossing in the UK and the car doesn't stop, you get furious because normally they stop. But in Paris, they don't necessarily stop at a zebra crossing. So don't just go for it. Look carefully, okay? The pelican crossings, the one with little lights, they'll tell you if it's green, if you can go. But still check, because there's a lot of traffic on these roads. You get bikes, you get skateboards, you get everything. So just be careful, huh? In case of illness, I'm not going to go through it now, but essentially, there are some English-speaking hospitals very close to here. There are pharmacies close to here. We'll put a little list on the wall there, so you could maybe take a photograph of it. And if you've got any, we're very fortunate in that we as a group have our own policeman and our own fireman that's looking after us, okay? So and the first person to go to if you're seriously ill with a kind of accident or emergency, I believe in Paris, is actually the fire service. They get you to the hospital quickly. But we'll put a little list up there. I think that's everything. We'll give you some tips about where to eat as well. Okay, but we'll put that on the wall later. Okay. Yes.
You can lean back in these chairs a little bit.
Yeah, they're. The chairs are economy plus, unless you're sitting on the back row there. The back row is very much economy, I'm afraid. Now, can everybody hear me okay? Okay. I used to be a teacher, so I should still have the voice, hopefully. Okay, so what I want to do now is just talk about some of the issues so you're aware of what the focus of this meeting is and maybe where the idea came from, and then where are we going forward? What's it going to lead to? Because I think, as it was said before, we have a lot of big meetings, and often everyone comes and everyone's encouraged and they go out feeling enthusiastic, and then nothing happens. So we're really trying to avoid that. And I've been given license by my UNICEF colleagues to talk on behalf of both agencies in terms of what's happening going forward. It doesn't mean to say it's just IIEP and UNICEF that are working together, though. It's the whole kind of global disability alliance. We're all linking up, and I think it's very exciting times. So essentially, UNICEF and IEP both feel that much progress has been made in terms of country commitments to inclusive education. So many countries understand why we need to do inclusive education, not just from a human rights perspective, but also from a human capital perspective. And a lot of people have a sense of what needs to be done in terms of inclusive education. But we feel that the big gap is really understanding, how do you do it? Now, before I joined IIP here, I used to spend a lot of time going to different ministries in Eastern and Southern Africa and then in East Asia Pacific. And frequently the permanent secretary would say, don't talk to me about policies, strategies and stuff like that, but just tell me how to do things. We have all the documentation on the wall. I can take you to my library if you want, which you guys have helped us construct. But just tell us, how do we actually do this? So the roundtable is the first step in responding to this challenge, and it's also a first step in a longer-term collaboration between IIP, UNESCO headquarters, GPE, and other key partners. And this explains why we invited senior government officials here, lead development partners, and people from disabled persons organizations to this meeting so that you can share experiences and insights on inclusive education with a focus on disabilities. Now, I'm choosing my words very carefully because the whole inclusive thing is very, very political. So I say with a focus on disabilities, but not neglecting all the other aspects. So the idea of the roundtable developed during 2 UNICEF regional workshops in inclusive education, which were held in Africa last year, when it was very nice that I was invited as the next regional advisor of UNICEF to those workshops. And Mark Waltham and I saw IIP's training capacity as a key complement to what UNICEF and other partners are doing, including, of course, UNESCO itself, at the advocacy and technical levels, as well as on the ground at the country level. So we thought what is really needed is some kind of training component so people can understand how to do it. So we agreed to work together on this technical roundtable and on the future development of training materials on inclusive education. And I think this was very timely because shortly after that, DFID announced their commitment to addressing the needs of children with disabilities. And we are indeed delighted that DFID is convening the Global Disability Summit next week. And it's no coincidence that this roundtable is actually the week before the summit, because the idea is that some of the ideas from this roundtable will actually lead into that summit next week. And indeed, we have been planning meetings and with the Global Alliance on Disabilities, which UNESCO, IIEP, and UNICEF are all deeply involved with, to ensure that our contribution to the emerging global agenda on disabilities is well positioned and strategic. Okay, so we're really trying to avoid duplication in the way forward. Our partners have been very encouraging, and we're really happy to know that we are organizing this meeting because they are very keen to ensure that inclusion is mainstreamed into education sector planning. Okay, it's not just a sideshow, but it's actually mainstream. So as you know, a good sector plan needs to be based not only on what is desirable as per the various conventions and so on, but also on what is feasible and affordable. Otherwise, it won't work. This has always been a challenge, not least for inclusive education. Even before we started talking about inclusive education, talking about equity, this has been a major challenge. So our rationale for inviting the 8 countries to this round table was to identify promising practices as well as challenges in achieving inclusive education. We will find many challenges, but we'll also find some promising practices. There is now a conceptual clarity over what inclusive education should look like, yet in reality, there are very few examples of countries that have actually achieved this. So we need to try and understand why is this the case, rather than perhaps see these countries as deviants, etc. We have to try and unpack why are some countries not going on that inclusive route. So don't feel ashamed if you have many gaps in your country, or your country's approach to disability would not be deemed to be inclusive in terms of, you know, the model that we showed earlier. It's not an issue of shame, it's an issue of trying to understand and trying to do things better. So while there's a global agreement on the need to have inclusive education systems, there is still a lack of clarity and consensus on exactly what this means when it comes to design. This is partly because inclusive education should also extend to other groups, of course, such as ethnic, linguistic minorities, those affected by conflict, gender stereotyping. Indeed, inclusive education policies must address all these different facets of exclusion. However, when it comes to planning, when it comes to implementation, trying to deal with all these issues simultaneously can be a real challenge in terms of planning and in terms of financing. Hence, for this roundtable, we decided to focus on one of the most excluded groups, as we've seen from the data which Angela presented, which is those with disabilities, and primarily on children, but certainly not exclusively on children, because we're talking about lifelong learning. So a rational approach to educational programming starts with a comprehensive national policy based on sound analysis, supported by key legislation, which is then translated into a plan, which is then fully funded, implemented, monitored, and evaluated, etc. This is a kind of model that IIP, UNESCO, and GP are trying to promote. But realities in many countries are very, very different. Some countries lack coherent policies, most lack comprehensive, achievable plans that are adequately funded. And in many countries, non-governmental actors have driven the agenda more than governments, or as much as government. And there is often much to applaud and learn from their efforts. But in most cases, the reach and impact of such initiatives have been very limited. At times, such approaches have also not been aligned to what we now understand as inclusive education. So most governments and development partners are now committed to the concept of systemic approaches. And that's what we'll be talking about over the next 3 days. What is a systemic approach? That systemic approaches have impact at scale. And this is how IIEP understands its support to sector analysis and planning. We frequently hear the argument that inclusive education may work in some contexts, but not in others. In response to such arguments, many agencies now agree that our approach to inclusive education must be progressive realization. I think that's incredibly important. Indeed, Article 4 of the CRPD states that each state party undertakes to take measures to the maximum of its available resources and where needed within the framework of international cooperation, with a view to achieving progressively the full realization of those rights. That's an important concept we need to bear in mind throughout the 3 days. At this meeting, we will learn about how different countries from Asia Pacific and Anglophone Africa are trying to help realize the rights of people with disabilities with a focus on education sector planning. After the meeting, we will gather insights and start to design training programs with a focus on planning for inclusive education. It's important to distinguish this focus from, for example, curriculum or classroom or materials development, which other agencies are better situated to work on, including UNESCO itself in headquarters, than IIEP. Our focus will be on education sector analysis and planning, but good planning needs to be linked to these other areas like innovations, for example, because that has an implication on the cost of inputs that go into a plan. So our intention is to develop training programs that respond to the needs of specific audiences. This could be defined in terms of region. We could start off with Anglophone, East and Southern Africa, for example, or it could be defined in terms of languages. Now, for this meeting, we are all what we call an Anglophone group, but we intend that the next roundtable we have will be for Francophone countries, possibly next year. So planning for inclusive education is a major challenge, as you will hear. There is no holy grail. There are experts in various domains, such as data, which is Daniel Mont, who we brought here. But ideas are still very emergent, and we are struggling to find models that work. Now, some people are a bit nervous before coming because we're calling everybody experts, and some people say, I'm not really an expert, and I'm not sure. But don't feel inhibited if you feel you're not an expert. Very few of us are experts. We're really learning together, and we're on a very steep learning curve. But hopefully you will feel that your understandings have been enhanced at the end of the 3 days, and that is the key reason why you've actually been invited here. So Jennifer will now take you through the specific objectives of the meeting and go through the agenda. But again, welcome. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jennifer Pye. I'm the event coordinator, so you might have seen my messages coming through, and I'm delighted to have you all here today. We've already met for 2 weeks online, and we had some interesting discussions going on online. The idea was really for us to meet online before so that we could get to know each other and to be more effective and more in-depth in our face-to-face discussions, which means you should normally have already an idea of who's who's doing what, how far some countries might have gotten, what some of the aspirations of some countries are. And I think that should get us to a good start for our discussions over the next 3 days. Let me briefly say a little bit about the objectives that we had identified when we invited you to this event. Let's see. Do you have the clicker, Tori?
It's loading. Let's see.
So let me say that during the online event, that happened for 2 weeks, you handed in some SWOT analysis, and I wanted to make reference to the SWOT analysis. I do believe that these SWOT analysis will become quite useful in the group works that we will be asking you to work on in your country teams. And that's basically the objective of the face-to-face, that we are looking to identify critical data analysis and capacity gaps at different institutional levels that may hinder efforts towards more inclusive education sector analysis. So this is one of the important objectives that we set each other for this event. We also want to discuss the importance and usefulness of an education sector analysis linked to intersectoral analysis as a key step in moving towards inclusive education sector plan preparation. And of course, we want to present and discuss tools and good practices in moving towards an education sector analysis on inclusive education, take stock of current practices in disability inclusive planning, both at national and subnational levels, and of course formulate the capacity needs, as Jim had mentioned, to be addressed in future IEP UNICEF training programs. I wanted here to draw your attention to the inclusive education framework that we drafted together with UNICEF for the event to frame the roundtable around thematic areas that look at inclusive education from a systems perspective. And that links up to what Rosangela was saying earlier about looking at inclusive education through a systemic lens. I would like you now to look at the roundtable agenda so I can take you through some of, or rather, the different sessions that we've organized. You can see on the first page, we've basically gone through the opening session. The first session we're now in. Mark Waltham will be following on with an introduction to the inclusive education framework that we actually put up there and that you already had an opportunity to discuss during the online phase. We will then see that we've structured the next 2.5 days with panel sessions where you as countries are going to be discussing the approaches to inclusive education sector planning that you have so far been taken, the challenges that you see in approaching planning for inclusive education. We do have 8 panels, and we're inviting different countries to sit on these panels, providing trigger questions for debate. So we were very deliberate in not asking countries to actually come with presentations, because we thought it would be more valuable for all of us to just provide space for discussion, for debate. We want to hear from everybody, and I think that's what Jim also was saying, that really in this area, I would say nobody is a real expert. We are all learning. And this was the idea of the roundtable. So that's why you see a lot of panel discussions, and you also see quite a bit of group work that we will encourage you to work in during these 3 days. In terms of extracurricular activities, we do have an excursion by boat, which is happening tonight at 6 o'clock. So we will invite you to join us all on a boat ride. And the second extracurricular activity is a reception, which happens on the second evening. The reception will take place here at IAP, and it'll basically be following straight into, after our session ends here, we'll be going straight into the reception, which will happen downstairs on the ground floor. And I also wanted to make sure I mention the presentation that Rosangela had referred to earlier, which will happen at 1 o'clock on Thursday, and it'll be in conference room number 4. Obviously, you will have lunch. You can have lunch before and then join Rosangela if you're interested in the topic. I think it's a great opportunity to have Rolando from UNICEF and Rosangela talk about their experience from Kenya. The closing session on Friday will basically end this event at 16:30. So we are hoping to come up with some actions for the country teams to take home, to look at some of the various thematic areas within the inclusive education framework and gain a better understanding of how far the 8 countries that are here present have gotten in the planning of inclusive education for children with disabilities. So that takes you through the program, and I'll basically hand over to my colleague Mark from UNICEF. Thank you. One moment.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to see everybody here. My name is Mark Waltham, and I'm also not an expert. So I work in at UNICEF. I'm an education advisor in New York. Do we run this with just with the mouse?
Right.
Yeah.
Left.
Yeah. Okay, and so this is a brief session, and I want to introduce you to the conceptual framework that we developed. The idea of the conceptual framework was really to structure these 3 days, or in fact the entire round table. And I just want to take you through our thinking in structuring it so that you understand why we put all the different bits where we have. This is very much a work in progress, and we would be very grateful for any suggestions, corrections, edits on this framework during the whole of the 3 days ahead of us. So, the idea, the SDG 4 says that we need to get all children who live in communities of one sort or another at the moment, we need to get them into the schools, all children, including children with disabilities, children who speak other languages, all children. People who work for ministries of education often look at this in terms of what you need to supply to get those children into school and the demand from the communities. So we started off the conceptual framework by talking about the supply side. And on the supply side, in terms of what you need for a school, well, obviously, the first thing, the most important thing you need is teachers. Yeah. You also need buildings, and you also need some learning materials. So the idea that sort of on the supply side, the framework is broken down into teachers, but this includes things like you can't just have anybody as a teacher. You need a properly trained teacher. So you need to train your teachers, you need to deploy them. And if you're going to get all children into school, those teachers need to be trained in inclusive pedagogies. They need to be able to deal with classrooms with various abilities and be able to control a class and to be able to make sure to meet all children's learning needs. In terms of infrastructure, we need to make sure that all schools are accessible. So for all children with disabilities. And learning materials, for children with disabilities, you might need books in Braille, you might need audio books, you might need books in easy read formats. So on the supply side, these are the things that you would need to consider when creating an education sector plan, when you're planning to make your education sector more inclusive. But there are also demand side issues. So demand side issues really means what are the things that are going to convince or stop the local communities from sending their children to school. And you all know these. So what are the main problems? What's the main thing keeping children with disabilities out of school at the moment? Do you think? Or you could just look at the board. Attitudes, it's stigma and discrimination, yeah, is almost certainly the main thing keeping children out of school. So if we want to get all children into schools, we have to address stigma and discrimination. We have to address people either not wanting to send their children to school because they're embarrassed or ashamed or whatever, but we also need to address the attitudes of school administrators, teachers, head teachers, who don't want to accept these children into school. Okay. What's another big thing? You're also allowed to look at the box. What's the biggest thing that keeps children out of school in the world today? Money, cost. Yes, that's right. So it can either be indirect costs like school fees, or it can be direct costs like school fees, or indirect school costs like school uniforms, like to buy textbooks or exercise books. But it can also be opportunity costs in if you're a very poor community. It's often better to have the kid at home working on, looking after the sheep or the goats or collecting water or doing the washing, than if you send them to school. We've also included a rather strange box, which we called risks and rewards. And what we mean by this is that on the demand side, there are a lot of, it's not exactly attitudes, it's sort of preconceptions about education, or even true preconceptions about education. So many people think that they don't want to send a child with a disability to school because it won't make any difference in the future. They won't get a job in the future anyway, so why bother? So better to keep them at home. That goes into that box. There's also the possibility that if a child with a disability is sent to school, they will be bullied or discriminated against by their peers, by the other children in the school. That's in that box as well. There's also the possibility, of course, that a child with a disability goes to school, gets a job, and is a productive member of society. If you believe that, if a family believes that, they are much more likely to send their children to school. Yeah. So all of these things are covered in this box. So the first two parts of the conceptual framework are the supply side, which is largely teachers' infrastructure and learning materials, and the demand side, which is all to do with attitudes of communities and the school system, administrators and teachers, costs, risks and rewards. But we're also, okay, so that's a fairly, and everybody's comfortable with the sort of demand and supply side terminology. But we're also very interested in making sure that children don't just go to school, they actually learn something when they're in school. So we also need to consider the quality of the education that all children receive in the classroom. And this is a bit more sort of complex. I mean, there's the obvious side of things that all ministries of education are always talking about, which is the curriculum. So the curriculum needs to be flexible and adaptable, and you might need to make accommodations when you're testing children during exams, either accommodations or adaptations for examinations. With children with disabilities, and in fact with all children, you also need to assess those children. So all teachers do this all the time. You're doing weekly tests or monthly tests to know how children are doing, whether they are understanding the stuff, the material. With children with disabilities, you also need to screen them for the disabilities. And this is one of the, in fact, you need to screen all children to see what is happening with them. If you have children with disabilities, those children need to go for assessment, and then they need to go, they need to be referred for assessment, and they need to be provided with assistive devices. So this whole area is really important. Children with disabilities who don't have assistive devices are not going to be able to go to school and learn properly. When you've got all the children in the classroom, the most important thing is to provide the right teaching for those children, whether those children have a physical impairment, a learning disability, or a developmental delay. So part of the quality set, part of the quality block in our diagram is you've got to get the right curriculum. You've got to make sure that students are assessed, screened, properly assessed, and then provided with assistive devices. And there has to be a continuous process of learning support, providing the right sort of teaching to those students. And this is a sort of a feedback loop. This has to happen continuously. Okay, so those are the three. Oh, am I really talking too much? Okay, those are the three main blocks. So these we call the service delivery blocks. So it's supply, which is teachers, learning demand, and quality. But then, to make sure all of this happens at the service delivery level, and I'm going to go really quickly, we also need to ensure that there are the right laws and policies in place, the right constitutional provisions. We need to make sure that there's good data and evidence on children. You can't make good policy decisions without the right data. You need good leadership. You need somebody, senior people in the government and particularly in the Ministry of Education who actually take this on and try to push forward. And you need good management throughout the entire education sector. And you also need money. You need the correct allocation of money, finance, and because the system all works on that. We call these four areas, we call these the enabling environments because they're sort of the overarching framework in order to allow the service delivery to take place properly. Interestingly enough, we actually have some data on quite a few of these boxes. So in the enabling environment, we've got some information on laws and policies and data and evidence. And we've also got some data on attitudes, teachers, infrastructure, and learning materials. And we do that this is UNICEF data. We do this. Oh, what's happening? Oh. Okay. So every year, UNICEF sends out, my UNICEF colleagues will know this, every year UNICEF sends out a massive questionnaire to all 150 country offices, yeah, and we ask about 6 things on inclusive education. So we ask about laws and policies, attitudes, EMIS, which is Education Management Information System, materials, the physical environment, which means school buildings, and human resources, which really means teachers, whether they are trained in inclusive pedagogies. And we rank them. They're either good or bad. So how many countries out of this 150 do you think have got good laws and policies in place? Anybody want to have a guess?
145.
As a percentage. But actually, you're not far wrong. Actually, it's been getting better. So the latest results we have are from 2017. At the moment, almost 90% of countries have got the right laws and policies in place. Yeah. What about attitudes? Attitudes, particularly amongst school administrators, on whether they think children with disabilities should go to normal schools, general schools.
50%.
50? 20. It's actually better than either of you two pessimists thought. It's actually close to 70%. EMIS? How many EMIS systems include data with children with disabilities? Some data on children with disabilities, not necessarily, particularly robust data. But how many EMIS systems? Okay. Yeah, it's more than 50. I know, I saw it. Okay, learning materials, accessible learning materials.
35.4%.
I love the precision.
Us.
Yeah, 40%. What about school buildings? What percentage of countries have got some or most school buildings? Some school buildings. 20. Yeah, about that. And what about trained teachers? Teachers trained in inclusive pedagogy?
That's very important.
That's right. The important thing, because I've got less than a minute left, the important thing to notice is that they're all on an upward track. So we're getting better, right? That's one thing. And second thing is that the laws and policies have been put in place. Everything else is lagging, it's behind. So our job really, everything's moving up. Our job really is to try and bring these up quicker to meet the laws and policies.
And UNICEF staff responding to this are very optimistic.
Possibly.
Sorry, Mark, what's the date in 2014?
Don't know. Yes, I know. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. No, I don't know. Yeah. And that's it. Thank you very much. And I think it's now yeah.
How attitude was made?
Yeah.
It's a totally subject.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It is totally. It is totally subjective.
Not to
Yeah.
say it to measure, right?
There are guidelines on how you measure it, but it's so. UNICEF staff have to talk to a certain number of teachers and administrators and say, should children with disabilities be in general schools? And they take the answers. I mean, that's the official process. I suspect that not many UNICEF staff actually do that. They just put down their what they have heard going around on school visits. Yeah.
Real quick, some information on the coffee.